Being buried alive is one of the most common phobias, and for good reason. Whether accidental or on purpose, once you find yourself in the dark, cramped and struggling for breath, it's not likely anyone will hear you screaming for help. Today, we're going to dive into the stories of those who found themselves in this exact situation. How they got there will surprise you. Before we get into it, if you haven't seen my videos before, I go in depth on stories relating to interesting and extreme things we as people face. If that's something you enjoy listening to, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you don't miss the next video. At 12:30 AM on September 2nd, 1987, Stephen Small, a wealthy businessman and heir to a media fortune in Illinois, was stirred out of his sleep by a phone call. When he answered, a police officer informed him that a burglary had taken place at a property he owned. When the call ended, Stephen got dressed and left his home to go and check on the property. 3 hours would pass without Stephen returning, and at 3:30 in the morning, the phone would ring again. When Stephen's wife Nancy answered, a man would inform her that they had her husband. After hearing her husband screaming that he was handcuffed inside a box, the kidnappers would then demand $1 million ransom for his release. Luckily, the phone the kidnappers were calling was already set up to record and track the location of incoming calls, and despite the fact the family was willing to pay the ransom, they went against the kidnappers' orders and called the police. At 5:04 PM, the phone would ring again, and this time the kidnapper would demand to know how much money had been collected for the ransom. This call would be traced to a nearby gas station in the area. Half an hour later, Nancy would answer another call, but this time it would be Stephen's aunt who informed Nancy the kidnappers called to tell her that her nephew was buried in a box and they knew Nancy's phone was tapped. At 11:28 PM, Nancy would receive another call, but this time it wasn't the kidnappers. It was a recording of Stephen, giving instructions on how to deliver the ransom. Nancy would receive another call from a gas station only 18 minutes later, where the kidnappers would accuse Nancy of having contacted the police and refuse her offer of ransom. Moments after this call, a police officer stationed in the area would see a car leave a gas station with its trunk partly open. Knowing all the calls from the kidnappers had been made from gas stations, police logged the number plate and traced it to a woman by the name of Nancy Risch. They would follow this car to Nancy's home, where Nancy and her partner Danny would exit the car and go inside. In the early hours of September 3rd, police would search the home, and eventually, Danny would lead police officers to the location they had buried Stephen Small in. The police officers rushed to dig him out of his 3-foot grave, quickly unearthing the box and ripping it open. Danny was confident Stephen was still alive. He had designed and built the box intended for Stephen for weeks before the kidnapping. The box was equipped with an air pipe to provide Stephen with oxygen, a light hooked up to a car battery, and stocked with water, candy bars, and chewing gum. Unfortunately, when they opened the box, they would find Stephen had already passed from asphyxiation. Despite Danny's preparation, the air pipe he had constructed had failed, and Stephen had run out of air. For his crime, Danny Edwards would receive the death penalty, but later, Illinois would abolish their death penalty system and his sentence would be lowered to life in prison. At the time, Nancy Risch would be sentenced to life in prison. But in 2017, Nancy's defense would petition for a reduction in her sentence, citing a new law created in 2016 allowing her to challenge her sentence providing she was a victim of domestic violence. Nancy would tell the courts she had helped Danny Edwards because he had threatened to kill her 8-year-old son. In February of 2022, Nancy Risch would be released after spending over 30 years in prison. Burying people alive to gain access to their wealth isn't limited to the 80s. In 1661, local butcher Lawrence Cawthorne would fall ill and become bedridden in his London residence. Around this time period, there was a law that stated if a tenant was to die in the place they were renting, the landlord would inherit all of their belongings. You might think a doctor or someone from a position of authority would have to declare someone dead before they were buried and all of their things were given away. But this was not the case. Usually, friends or family would declare someone dead, but anyone could make the claim someone had passed away. Lawrence's landlady, understanding these laws, pronounced Lawrence dead and quickly organized his burial at a local church. As the final pieces of dirt filled in his grave, the gravediggers would hear Lawrence screaming from inside his coffin. They would rush to dig Lawrence out, but by the time they unearthed the 6-foot grave, Lawrence had already run out of oxygen. When they opened the coffin, they would find his burial shroud shredded and his face swollen and bloodied from hitting it against the lid as he attempted to escape. You may think people are the only ones capable of burying someone alive, but it turns out bears do too. Around May 2015 in Siberia, 54-year-old Natalia was collecting birch sap in the forest with her friend and family dog when a brown bear appeared from the brush and charged her. The bear first attacked Natalia's dog as she attempted to escape, but quickly caught up to her and began tearing into her legs. Natalia attempted to fight it off with the tool she had been using to collect sap, and her friend, 80-year-old Valentina, began hitting the bear with a stick. The bear would turn on Valentina, knocking her over before returning to Natalia. Luckily, despite her age, Valentina was able to escape and find help. Soon the bear, satisfied with its attack and under the belief Natalia was dead, began to bury her alive. When rescuers arrived, the bear was shot, and a bloodied Natalia was found screaming for help, almost completely buried. We tend to think the time of accidental burials is in the past, and something that could never happen today, but this story will have you thinking otherwise. In 2015 in Macedonia, Greece, a group of children playing next to a nearby cemetery would hear the faint sounds of a woman screaming from underneath one of the graves. Terrified, the children would run and tell their parents, who reported it to police. Shortly after, the grave would be dug up, and inside they would find the warm body of a 45-year-old who had passed away from asphyxia. An investigation would take place, and it would be found the woman had been confirmed dead by a private hospital before she was buried. What's even more terrifying is in 2015, just a year later, in the exact same suburb, a 49-year-old woman was declared dead due to cancer. After her burial, her family would be standing by her grave when they too began to hear screaming from below them. The woman's body had been dug up, but unfortunately, it was too late. The woman had passed away from heart failure while inside the coffin. After another investigation, it would be found the medication she had been taking as part of her cancer treatment was what caused her to be declared clinically dead by the hospital. On the 4th of January, 1891, Octavia Hatcher gave birth to her son Jacob, who sadly passed away hours after birth. Falling into a deep depression, Octavia remained bedridden for months and eventually slipped into a coma. Only 4 months after the death of her newborn son, Octavia would be pronounced dead and buried in the local cemetery. Over time, the same disease which had put Octavia into a coma began to sweep through the town, but soon it was realized the people affected were not actually dying and eventually woke up. With news of people coming out of their slumber, Octavia's husband James began to agonize over the thought he had buried his wife alive. Eventually, this thought became too much for him, and James had Octavia's grave dug up. Those who laid eyes on the coffin after it was opened would be haunted with its image for the rest of their life. Octavia's face was contorted in horror, the lining of her coffin had been scratched apart, and her fingernails were broken and bloody. It was clear to all, including James, that Octavia had awoken in the coffin in a state of terror and attempted to claw her way out before eventually suffocating. James, heartbroken and horrified, would erect a life-size statue in Octavia's honor. Fearing the same fate as his wife, James would even go as far as to order a custom coffin to be built, which would enable him to ring a bell above the grave if he woke up to find himself in the same situation. In 1937, 19-year-old Frenchman Angelo Hayes was involved in a motorcycle accident, throwing him off his motorcycle and headfirst into a brick wall. After it was confirmed at the scene that Angelo did not have a pulse, he was pronounced as dead and sent to the morgue. When his parents arrived to view the body, the morgue would tell them Angelo's face was so disfigured from the accident that they were not allowed to see it. Trusting the doctors who had pronounced him dead and the morgue who now had his body, Angelo's parents proceeded with planning his funeral. 3 days after they had said goodbye to their son and buried him in the ground, Angelo's father would get a call from his insurance company. The insurance company would claim they needed to verify the cause of Angelo's death because his father had taken out a sizable life insurance policy on him right before his death. Now, you might think the reports from the police and the doctors would be enough to confirm he hadn't murdered his son, but the insurance company wasn't convinced. They ordered Angelo to be dug up so they could rule out for themselves that he had not been murdered by his father. So, much to the horror of his parents, Angelo's grave was dug up, his body pulled from his grave and unwrapped for inspection. But what the doctor inspecting the body found surprised him. Despite the time that had passed, the body was still warm, and the doctor called for Angelo to be taken back to the hospital. It would turn out that Angelo had been in a deep coma, and though this was why he was buried, it also saved him. In this comatose state, his body's need for oxygen was so low that he didn't suffocate during his 3 days underground. After undergoing multiple surgeries and rehabilitation, Angelo would recover completely from his injuries, and his story would make him a celebrity. Not only did people travel across France to speak with him, but he then went on to invent a coffin in 1974 that provided enough oxygen for a living person to survive for 30 hours, presumably giving them time to call for help. On top of that, he would demonstrate this invention by staying in the coffin for 30 hours, and 10 years later, invent another coffin that would support a person for 2 days, which he again demonstrated by locking himself in. Angelo would eventually pass from old age in 2008 at the age of 90 years old.